webinar. All right, so today's webinar is Shorebirds Around Wisconsin Lakes by Dr. Marie Perkins from UW-Stevens Point's Wildlife Department. Marie is an assistant professor in wildlife ecology here at UWSP. She received her bachelor's degree from Central Michigan University, a master's degree from Louisiana State, and her PhD from McGill University in Montreal. Prior to starting at UWSP this past fall, she was working as a postdoc researcher at Harvard. Marie's research interests have focused on wetlands, wetland birds, and contaminants. So take it away, Marie.
All right, I'm gonna go ahead and flip over to my PowerPoint. Thanks for that introduction, Paul. All right, so I'm really happy to be here today virtually to chat with you guys a little bit about shorebirds and shorebirds around Wisconsin lakes, a little more specifically. It's fun because this was always supposed to be a Zoom presentation, but now I've gotten much better at these. So previously I would have been probably a lot more confused as to what was going on, but here we are. I am happy to take questions as we go. I don't mind. So if you do send a chat in, I'll be happy to answer that question. So just kind of a little bit more about me. Paul gave me a really nice introduction, but just to kind of give you a little bit more on my background, I've been working with shorebirds for many years now. I've got an example here of me with a eastern willet. We were capturing them in the Northeast Atlantic to put trackers on them to investigate their migration patterns, their stopover sites, and their wintering grounds. And there's a fun picture there on the right of me getting that willet out of its nest in a large patch of poison ivy. So shorebirds are often quite fun. And a little bit of the results of that study that I worked on, you can kind of see for two different willets that we captured up in Maine or Massachusetts, kind of their spring migratory path there in the green, and then their fall migratory path there in the brown. And this was pretty new information. We didn't have a good feel for how these birds were migrating previously. Addition to this study that I did on eastern willets, for my PhD work, I focused on looking at the exposure and effects of pollution on shorebirds breeding in the Arctic. So I focused specifically on mercury, which is a widespread global contaminant that's been increasing due to human activity. So I had 9 study sites across the Alaskan and Canadian Arctic where researchers were capturing shorebirds of 11 different species and sampling blood and feathers for me to investigate their contaminant loads. And overall, we found that shorebirds were not too heavily exposed to mercury across the Arctic, but that some of the species we investigated were at a much greater risk. And some of the locations, like our Barrow site there up in northern Alaska, did have some pretty high concentrations. So that's kind of my background related specifically to shorebirds. As Paul mentioned, I'm new here to Wisconsin, so I don't have a lot of experience with Wisconsin shorebirds yet, but I'm hoping to be able to gain some of that experience moving forward. I'm really happy to be here in Wisconsin. I grew up in Michigan, so I have a strong association with the Midwest and Midwest birds. So I'll give some kind of overviews on shorebirds going forward. So there's about 50 species of North American shorebirds. There's a few additional vagrants that may be found across North America, but kind of the regularly occurring shorebird species consist of kind of 4 different families. We've got stilts and avocets, oyster catchers, which occur mostly just on the coasts, the oyster catchers. And then we've got plovers and sandpipers there, which have kind of the majority of the species are from kind of that shorebird family. So of these species of shorebirds that occur across North America, about 34 of them occur regularly here in Wisconsin. And about 6 of those species are regular breeders within Wisconsin. So shorebirds have quite a bit of diversity across the group. Again, there's 50 different species. You can even kind of just see from these silhouettes a bit difference in kind of bill shape and leg shape. And they have some, differences in their breeding habitat, wintering habitat, and migration. But there are quite a few similarities in these species of shorebirds kind of across the majority of the species. No, I've got a question coming in about herons and egrets. And so they are not considered to be shorebirds. They're kind of in a different group of just kind of general water birds, although shorebirds are sometimes kind of incorporated in this overall water bird group. But herons and egrets are quite a bit, have a bit different life history than our shorebirds. Yeah, the same, another question came in, the same with bitterns. So bitterns are also kind of included in overall in water birds, but not specific to shorebirds. So bitterns and rails as well are included in kind of this secretive marsh bird group, which I also have a background in for my master's. I studied rails in Louisiana, and rails and bitterns are also using lakeshores for their breeding and migratory habitat. So they're also really interesting birds that use lakeshores, but slightly different life histories. I'm gonna just scooch this chat over so I can see. All right, so some of the kind of similarities that we have across our different shorebird species. So the majority of shorebirds are migratory, almost all of them. And many of them are these, what we consider to be long distance migrants. So I've got an example here of the red knot, which winters way down at the tip of South America, and then migrates all the way north to breed up in the far Arctic. And this is kind of the extreme example of our long distance migrants and our shorebirds, but many of the species breed up in the far north Arctic and winter down in South America. And because of this long distance flight that they sustain both in the fall and in the spring, they are subjected to some really kind of rigorous physiological stressors. So they're pretty amazing birds that are able to kind of undertake these amazing physiological feats. And one of the things that's really important to them, which I'll talk about a bit more, are these stopover sites that they are encountering along their migration path. And because they're extenuating like quite a lot of energy in these long sustained migrations, being able to refuel and have stopover habitat that has a lot of good high quality food source is really important to these birds. Okay. And just to kind of emphasize these migration pathways, So we have a couple of pathways that occur across North America. And you can see right here that one of the main four pathways or flyways does go right across Wisconsin. So Wisconsin does, and kind of the Great Lakes area is a very important migratory pathway and migratory stopover location for these North American shorebirds. So we've got that the majority of these shorebirds are migrants and long distance migrants. The other common characteristic is that they are invertivores. So this means that they're foraging on insects and other invertebrates, including mussels and clams. And generally, they're foraging either at the land surface, or they're using their bills to probe into the sediment to get these insects and invertebrates out. And one of the things that when we think about shorebirds, they're often kind of in the same habitat and occurring in the same locations. You'll see them in these kind of large foraging groups of mixed species, but they do tend to kind of separate out their foraging due to this bill length. So you can see kind of in the schematic, the kind of dramatic differences in bill shape and size due to the length of their bill. And the question that came in is the depth in centimeters, and I forgot that. It was hard to read the label on this figure. I think it is in centimeters. Yeah, it should be in centimeters based on what species those are. And that's not even as some of them, I should have pulled up some of the kind of species that have an amazing bill. I don't know that I have any photos of those guys for you, but some of the, godwits and wimbrels have these really long bills that can forage quite deep into the sediment. So again, with these shorebirds, there's some diversity within them, but they really all are, the majority of them are utilizing these lakeshore habitats at some point within their life history. So here in Wisconsin, I'll point out that all the photos that I have going forward are of shorebirds that occur here in Wisconsin, either during migration, or I'll talk a bit more about our breeding shorebirds a bit further into the talk. But these are all species that you will be able to find here in Wisconsin around the lakes. So they encompass kind of these 5 different lakeshore habitats. Some of them are kind of exclusive to certain habitats, but oftentimes you'll find them, the different species kind of mixed among the different habitats. So one of the kind of big areas that shorebirds are using are just kind of this shallow lake edge. So when shorebirds are foraging, there are kind of 2 aspects to where they're going to be foraging based on water depth. So one is that bill length, right? So depending on how long their bill is, but then the other one is their leg length. So shorebirds have a pretty big range in size, of kind of these really, really small guys with really short legs to some of our longer legged waders, like the image here of our greater yellow legs. So that's going to kind of depend on how shallow of the lake edge that they're going to use. But again, they're not these long-legged waders like the herons and egrets. So even the longer-legged shorebirds are still going to be, need to be in depth where they can stand. So we've got kind of these edges of lakes is one of the main lakeshore habitats that shorebirds are using. We also find them really commonly on mud flats. So, and here we've got some some shorter-legged shorebirds in our Dunlin. And because these shorebirds are foraging oftentimes by probing into the sediment to get their invertebrates out, they do want this kind of moist, wet soil that they can easily probe with their bills. So a lot of times when around Wisconsin, when you get kind of low lake levels in the spring or fall and create these mud flats, is when you're going to get larger numbers of shorebirds coming through and stopping here in Wisconsin. These mud flats are really important habitat that are not always present across the landscape, depending on precipitation patterns. Oftentimes, managers will specifically draw down areas where they have the ability to manage the water levels in order to create these mud flats during these kind of peak migration times for shorebirds to be able to stop over and forage and gain enough high quality food source to continue on this long migration that they have. Our beach habitats here in Wisconsin are also really important shorebird habitats. So along the Great Lakes and our kind of sandy beaches are really important habitat to some shorebird species. And I'll talk a bit more about our piping plover a little bit later in our talk. Not all species are going to be using the beach, but especially our species with our plover here with our short little bills, they're going to be more likely to be foraging right at that surface of the substrate. And so they are, like these beach areas, often kind of foraging on either small insects or small mussels along the lakeshore. Some of our shorebirds prefer a bit of a rocky shoreline. So specifically, our ruddy turnstone here is a good species to think about when we think about our rocky shorelines. Ruddy turnstones are called turnstones for a reason. They wander around these pebbly beaches and turn over the stones to forage on the invertebrates underneath. And then lastly, we have the shallow water marshes. So these can kind of relate to the shallow lake edge, but maybe with a bit of a thicker vegetation along that lake edge. These are can be kind of similar habitats to that lake edge or a mud flat with shallow vegetation so that the shorebirds can stand, but the good invertebrate food source there for them. And again, sometimes this can depend on water level fluctuations within our lakes, depending on how heavily flooded or shallow the marsh habitat is for them to use. And again, a lot of times you're going to be finding, especially during migration, you'll be finding these kind of you can find large congregations of multiple species using this same lakeshore habitat. So another important characteristics of our shorebirds is that many of the species are suffering population declines. So we can see kind of from this schematic, this is goes up to kind of from the 1970s to 2016. This is a figure specifically related to Canadian birds. And again, our shorebirds are really heavily breeding up in the Arctic, right? So a lot of our shorebirds are utilizing the Canadian Arctic. And so the Canadian populations are really reflective of the populations that we would see here in Wisconsin during migration. And we see that kind of over this time frame, there's been a pretty dramatic decrease in overall. Can kind of just see that here in our orange line. And then there are other species that are suffering even more dramatic population declines. So Many of the species are declining, and particularly I wanted to point to our red knot here that I talked about previously, that had that really long migration starting down in the, wintering down in that south tip of South America. And this is a group of birds that has been really, really dramatically hit and been suffering some pretty serious population declines. So just a little bit about kind of overall why shorebirds are experiencing these population declines. One, kind of the major reason is habitat loss. And this is particularly important during the migration period. So the loss of these stopover habitats, which occur kind of in Central America and then kind of the lower US, right? From our migratory maps that we looked at earlier. And so kind of this reduction in coastal marsh loss, as well as our interior marsh loss, the loss of our kind of beaches due to development, right? A lot of people like to build their houses near to beaches and coasts. And so again, as I mentioned previously, these stopover sites are really vital for these birds, especially birds like the red knot that are migrating really long distances in order to get that important fuel that they need to continue on their migration pathway. So the loss of these stopover habitats is really important. Climate change is also playing a pretty big role. So particularly, as I mentioned, a large number of these shorebird species are breeding up in the North American Arctic. This is where some of my PhD work took place, and in that project I worked with a big collaboration, the Arctic Shorebird Demographics Network, which was really focused on trying to determine some of the causes of shorebird declines on the breeding grounds. So they were up there looking at nest success, looking at return rates of the shorebirds from year to year after migration, looking at contaminants, which was part of my work, and a few kind of other projects that they had going on. And one of the kind of big important projects they were looking at was this idea of climate mismatch. So our shorebirds go up to the Arctic because there's a really high quality food source up there. So, so they're able to get a lot of food and the insect emergence and for their young, for the nesting young. And this makes it worthwhile for them to undertake these long migrations and also deal with kind of these harsh Arctic conditions during the breeding season. When they get up there in the spring, there's still snow on the ground. You know, they kind of deal with these really quick, they have to kind of get their nesting over quickly because the kind of nesting period up in the Arctic is short. But one of the things that they've been looking at is this idea of the arrival time of the shorebirds is starting to not match up with the peak emergence of the food source for the young. So when the young are hatching, is after the peak of insect emergence as the Arctic warms. So this has been, you know, a pretty important aspect in the species decline. And then my work, which looked at contaminants, which we, from my work, think might not play a huge role for all of the species across the Arctic, but may be an additional stressor on these birds. So they're already under a lot of stress just due to their life history aspects of this long-term migration, the harsh breeding season, and then adding you know, habitat loss on their stopover sites, as well as climate change. That contaminants might just be this extra stress on these birds adding to their declines. And lastly, just this idea of human activity, which we'll talk a bit about when I talk a bit about piping plovers. And then hunting, which is not common in kind of the lower US, but on some of the stopover sites in the Caribbean, as well as some South American areas, they are actively hunted, particularly the Caribbean islands. And again, just to point out that the stopover habitat is really vital, and that's kind of where Wisconsin plays a role, and Wisconsin lake shores, which provide this vital stopover habitat during migration. So kind of switching a bit from our migratory shorebirds. We got a few of the kind of examples of the shorebirds that are migrating through Wisconsin. But again, just as a reminder, we've got about 34 species that are regularly occurring here in Wisconsin. The majority of those we're going to be seeing during the spring migration in May at the stopover sites, and during the fall migration. So the spring migration can be pretty concentrated with a lot of the birds are just trying to get really quickly up to that breeding ground in the Arctic. And then the fall migration tends to be a bit more spread out with different species kind of coming through at different times, but kind of extends from this late summer to early fall timeframes. So that's kind of when we're going to see the majority of the migrating species coming through Wisconsin. But then we do have these 6 species that are regularly breeding here in Wisconsin. So I'll talk about a few of them. So first off, we've got our upland sandpiper and our American woodcock. But so the downside on these guys is that they're kind of these oddball shorebirds. So they're still shorebirds and grouped in with that, and do have some of these similar characteristics, but they don't use lake shores. Our upland sandpiper here is a grassland bird, and they're here in Wisconsin breeding in grassland habitats, and even kind of during migration, and a little bit more in wintering ground, they use a little bit wetter habitat, but overall they're really just kind of, it's right there in their name, using the uplands. Additionally, we've got our American woodcock, which is a kind of early successional forest species. So they still like the ground to be a bit moist, but they're not at all using our lake shorelines. So out of the 6 species regularly occurring here during the breeding season, 2 of them are not really using our lake shores. But we've got a couple of species that are here breeding in Wisconsin during the summer. And they are using our lake shores. So quite a few of our breeding shorebirds here in Wisconsin tend to be widespread breeders across North America. These are generally not extending as dramatically up into the Arctic, and tend to be kind of more short distant migrants. So you can see kind of with our killdeer here, this may be one of the shorebirds that you guys are more familiar with. They're really pretty common and widespread across North America. You can see the range map there on the right with the kind of orangey peach color. That's I've got a few maps, so you'll see this kind of same color scheme, but the orangey kind of peach color is going to be the just breeding season range. That purple color is year-round population, so birds are there, killdeer are there, are breeding and wintering in that area. And then the blue is, the wintering grounds. Just one second here. The downside of being on a video is I think I'm speaking a bit quicker than I would if I was with you guys in person. So our killdeer is one of our 9 plover species. And they do nest in a pretty wide variety of habitats across Wisconsin here. You may be familiar with them in the picture here on the right, which is kind of, they do this injured wing act. If you get near to their nests, they'll jump around on the ground and pretend as though they've got a broken wing or an injured wing in order to distract a predator away from their nest. But they're going to be nesting in areas nearby our lake shores, so kind of our sandbar habitat, as well as mud flats. But they're also will move kind of more into these human modified habitats in pasture lands or agricultural systems, as well as just kind of, you can sometimes find them on like roadside or kind of gravelly parking lot areas. They're a pretty adaptable shorebird, which will use kind of our lake shores, but these more modified habitats as well. And again, kind of one of the more common birds out there, and you may have heard them calling. The killdeer is kind of in their call. All right. So again, another one of our breeding shorebirds here in Wisconsin is the spotted sandpiper, and you can kind of see that the how they look is in their name. They've got these spots all along their white breast, and they are also very widespread across North America. And again, with the same kind of range map, we see the orange coloration of the breeding area, yellow is migratory range, and then the wintering ground. And these guys are also using our lake shores during the nesting season. So they're known to kind of breed along the shoreline, but they'll also use a variety of habitats in grasslands and into forest areas. And then kind of, again, one of our more abundant and widespread shorebirds is the Wilson snipe. This was previously the common snipe. The name change is somewhat recent. And they are, again, pretty common across North America, breeding here in Wisconsin. They are a bit similar looking to our woodcock that we saw earlier with that kind of long bill and stocky body. And they're going to be, again, also nesting in this kind of variety of habitat, including kind of this marshy edge along our ponds, rivers, and brooks, as well as, you know, marshy lake edges. But they'll head into some bogs and willows and swamps as well. And you can see they've got that kind of nice long bill for foraging a bit deeper than some of the other birds that we've looked at. So kind of the last shorebird I want to focus on a bit here is our piping plover. So this Great Lakes population of piping plover are really a highly endangered species. Back kind of in the 40s and 50s, there were only about 17 breeding pairs in the Great Lakes area. And so there's been a lot of effort to increase our breeding population of these Great Lakes piping plovers. So they were added to the Wisconsin Endangered Species List in 1979. And they've been listed as federally endangered since the mid-80s. And so these guys are kind of beach dwellers, so they nest right on the beach. And along the Great Lakes. So these are our kind of iconic Great Lake shorebird species. And the kind of historically, the declines have been related to historic hunting pressure, although there may be some hunting pressure on them still outside of the US. Again, this habitat loss, beaches are really popular locations for human development. So a lot of their kind of sandy beach areas have been lost, related to this shoreline development, as well as recreational pressure. So they are nesting right on the beach, which is also where beachgoers like to be as well. So their habitat is really right where people would want to be, you know, laying out their beach blankets and recreating. And kind of along with that is, along with natural predators that they may have in their kind of beach nesting grounds, dogs tend to be really disruptive. So lots of people like to run their dogs on the beach, bring their dog down, you know, to the Great Lake beaches and for recreation. But these are really, dogs are really disruptive to piping plovers, as they can cause them to abandon their nests due to kind of predation pressure. They think of them as being predators, even if they're not actively predating the nests. So due to kind of these variety of causes of the declines, there's been a lot of work going into improving piping plover habitat, nesting habitat. So they really kind of like these isolated beaches, they're really pretty, they have a lot of problem with disturbance. So they're easily disturbed, I guess would be the way you might want to say that, that they'll abandon their nests pretty quickly with a lot of disturbance. And so they really need these isolated areas. Often on these kind of cobbly beaches, you can see they lay their nests right there on the ground, on the beach. They don't really make much of a nest, just a little indentation with their eggs. This is kind of a common shorebird nesting. Sometimes there'll be other species will make a little bit more of a nest, but overall they're you know, just kind of right there on the ground. You can kind of see the shape of the eggs there, which they're a bit pointed at one end to kind of keep them from rolling away and kind of aim towards each other. And so in Wisconsin, we find piping plovers along Lake Michigan and Lake Superior. There are in Michigan more of these Great Lakes piping plovers that are, you know, on the other side of Lake Michigan, as well as some other kind of areas, but mostly Lake Michigan and Superior, kind of the main breeding habitat for the Great Lakes piping plovers. And so their nesting period is kind of this time of avoidance where we want to not be on the beaches, and that's going to be, you know, mid-May to kind of the end of June there. And so some of the ways that they've been protecting piping plover habitat is beach closures. So you can see kind of some examples here of just closing off the beach. And this is not super popular as you might think, right? So people also want to be able to recreate on the beaches, love our beaches here, but one of the main ways to kind of improve our piping plover populations is by just closing the beach to keep disturbance out. Additionally, there are a lot of efforts to find all the piping plover nests here in Wisconsin as well as in Michigan. And especially when the eggs are still there, put these exclosures to keep any predators out away from the nests. Once the young hatch, they can pretty easily get out of the exclosures. The mesh is not that large or that small. It just keeps the predators out and also gives a good indication of where the nests are on the beach in order to keep people back as well. So this has been kind of one of the main ways that they've been trying to improve these piping plover populations. Oops, sorry about that. again, just with our exclosures. So even though they've been, really working to improve the population, there still really are only a few breeding pairs in Wisconsin. So I mentioned that kind of in the 50s, the population got down to being about 17 pairs total. The population has increased pretty dramatically from them, with the majority of those being in Michigan and along the Lake Michigan sandy beaches and sandy and cobbly beaches over in Lake Michigan. We've got a few pair breeding up along Lake Superior in the Apostle Islands. And then recently there has been, I think 1 to 2 pairs over in the Green Bay area that have been breeding. So it's been a bit of a kind of long haul to get the populations up. But they are quite a fun little bird there. That's a good, I've got a good question here about the genetic bottleneck. And, I am not as familiar with that. So there are other populations of piping plover across the US, all of which are not doing well. So we also have piping plovers over on the Atlantic coast, and there are some that even breed on islands within the Mississippi River. And I'm not sure how much genetic transfer occurs amongst these populations, or really what they've done to improve that over time. Again, like I said, with just those 17 birds initially back in the 50s. That's a good question. I'd have to look into it a little bit more to see what they've done about that. This is a good question as well. So about do the nesting adults mind the exclosures? They don't seem to. They do pretty well within the exclosures, and they do continue to incubate the eggs. Again, here in our Great Lakes population, they really use these exclosures basically on all the nests that they find. So here in the Great Lakes, and also I know a bit more about the Atlantic population, there's a really large effort to every spring go out to these areas that piping plovers have been nesting on these beaches, find all the nests, and make sure that the nests are signed to keep people away from them, and closing those areas of the beaches, as well as put these exclosures up. So they seem to still do pretty well with the exclosures. I think it's, and actually I don't know about recently, but probably I do know that like back when I was kind of an intern in Michigan, one of the kind of common jobs you could get in the summer was basically to be a piping plover nest watcher. So not only would you go out and find these nests, but then you would just kind of literally sit there and watch the nests and in the exclosures, and keep people away from the nest, keep people's dogs. The dogs were really, the stories that I heard from these people that were these piping plover nest watchers, where that dogs were kind of the main thing that they would have to deal with, and especially off-leash dogs, just kind of running the beaches and trying to keep them back and away from the nesting adults. But the exclosures seem to be really one of the only ways to get good production. So yeah, they actually do work pretty well. And I think this is kind of the end of my talk. Oops, sorry, I meant to go back. And I'm happy to take more questions if you guys have about shorebirds in Wisconsin, or in the Arctic, which is a bit more of my knowledge base. I'm kind of gaining a bit more familiarity with shorebirds in the Wisconsin area.
Well, thank you, Marie. We'll give it a minute to see if there's more questions that pop into the chat box. There's one I see.
Yes. So this is a question I get really almost every time I talk about my PhD work. And the story behind it is pretty sad in that I actually never got to go up to the Arctic. So I worked with this really amazing collaboration, which was it's the Arctic Shorebird Demographics Network. It's a collaboration with academic, a bunch of different universities, as well as the U.S. Fish and Wildlife Service, the USGS. Though there's another one that's a nonprofit that I'm forgetting right now. And, you know, I had this kind of amazing group of researchers that were the ones up there dealing in the Arctic. But I will tell you, one of my study sites that, of course, I did not go to, but we really didn't get a lot of samples from it. So it's one of our, the Canadian Arctic sites. We got very few samples of it from it because the one year the polar bears were so bad that really the researchers could not leave their camp building. So they really would have, you know, polar bears in their camp, and to the extent that it was dangerous for them to leave the building at some points in time. So I did get some of those kind of interesting stories out of the Arctic, but sadly, I never got to go up. Yeah, so some questions about my PhD work looking at mercury and Arctic shorebirds. Yeah, so I had a preliminary study in the just in Alaska that had looked at mercury from the Barrow study site and a few other sites, and then there was another site kind of another study in eastern Canada that also kind of found some high exposures. And so when we started this project, expanding it across the Arctic, we really thought that mercury was going to be more widespread. We thought we were going to find problems all over. And so we really were, it really was good news that kind of the majority of the species, I had 2,500 samples that we looked at from shorebird samples that we looked at. So a really large, wide ranging project. And we really, you know, found that it was just kind of a small proportion of them that were being exposed at levels that were likely to be causing kind of, you know, known effects. Although there still could be some, you know, low level, again, like I said, extra stressors involved with that exposure. But it was pretty good news, I thought. I've got another question here, just a second. Yeah, so this one, I'll just read it. So it just talks about encouraging native grasses, rushes, and sedges along the lakeshore for cover and nesting habitat, and then lowering the water level would support invertebrates, and I definitely agree. And you know, the timing of this is also really important. Like I said, a lot of kind of the high concentration are going to be coming, shorebirds are going to be coming through during that spring migration, and they're going to be rushing to get up to the Arctic, you know, and often low on energy reserves. And the better shape they are in once they get up to the Arctic, the more successful they are likely to be on the breeding grounds. So having that, you know, water levels at a good depth for them during that migrating time period would be, yeah, is really important. So for the piping, so the next question is, how do they keep track of all the breeding pairs? And I think this is referring to the piping plovers. So I'm gonna scroll back a few slides. So we can kind of see this guy here. These, this is and our young, so our adult and our young. Because at this point, there's still, you know, not a huge number of breeding pairs. They do try to capture and band with individual color bands. You can kind of see this guy here has got an orange flag, and I forget the colors can, often relate to the flags relate to the state, I think, and then this kind of unique color combination of the smaller band. So you can kind of see they've all got even the young have this orange flag, which is relating to where they're captured, and then they get a unique set of color bands, and you can kind of just see the aluminum USGS numbered band as well. So they really go through, and as the young hatch, put bands on the young, these individually marked color bands, as well as on any adults that they may have missed as young. You know, that's a good, so the next question is on how are they capturing? So I'm not 100% sure. I'm not personally worked with piping plover, but some of the ways that shorebirds are often captured, so during migration, they are generally captured in mist nets. I've done a little bit of this work, but because, as I mentioned, they're often kind of, especially in these kind of shallow lakeshore areas, or mud flats, they'll be in these kind of large multi-species groups. You can put mist nets out in those areas and capture large numbers as they're kind of foraging during migration. So that's a really common method. Sometimes they're captured in mist nets during the breeding season as well. But because, especially if we're talking about our piping plovers where they're a bit spread out and you know where their nests are, another really good way to capture shorebirds is to capture them on their nests. So one thing about shorebirds that is kind of fun is they're really like to stick with their nests. They're really pretty protective of their eggs and their nest, and they're really other than, you know, like I said, the piping plovers are not great on lots and lots of disturbance. They still tend to come back to their nests. So there's a couple different kind of nets that you can use to put around or at the nest, so that when the adults, they'll be kind of moved off the nest when you go out there, but then they'll come back and you can capture them in that trap on the nest. Or the kind of back at the beginning, I was showing capturing willets, in which we would take mist nets and lay them on top of the nest. And again, the birds would kind of hold tight so they wouldn't flush off very, we could get pretty close before they would flush off. I think this question is related to the low number of breeding pairs of piping plover. And that just goes back to kind of a few of these kind of reasons. Historically, they've just, a lot of it just has to do with that their habitat is really right on these, the breeding habitat is right on these beaches where people also want to be. So that kind of habitat loss and disturbance during the breeding season. So that's, I don't know if anyone else wants to add into the chat. I think I've caught up.
And we have a few minutes left yet. There's another question for you.
Right. Yeah, so, okay, so two, again, more kind of piping plover questions. Yeah, piping plovers will abandon their nests with young. Ooh, that's a good question. I'm not sure if once, so because shorebirds have these, you know, precocial young, the young are pretty, really mobile once they hatch. So once the young hatch, they're pretty much immediately out of the nest and able to kind of forage and move around for themselves. And so the beach becomes, again, part of their food source, but they're a bit more mobile. So that I think they're more likely to abandon the nests due to disturbance when they're still eggs. Again, because they can kind of move around a bit more once the young are out and about. So I wasn't really able to find the totally up-to-date number on piping plover nests in the Great Lakes, but the kind of more recent number, which was I think from 2007, was kind of indicating that there was kind of this bumper crop of piping plover that it was, the kind of the highest level they had seen up to that point. And I think it was 76 breeding pairs in Michigan, in the Michigan Great Lake area, and then here in Wisconsin, it sounded like there's maybe kind of 5 or 6 nests up along Lake Superior, and then 1 to 2 nests in the Green Bay area. Okay, I think I'm caught up again.
I did put a question in earlier when a lot of them came in all at once, asking if there's certain kinds of insects that the shorebirds, either Wisconsin or otherwise, are looking for.
Yeah, so again, is a bit dependent on the species. So, we've got these kind of little short-billed guys that are kind of pecking along the surface, and they're going to be kind of more interested in those kind of mobile, maybe like spiders or kind of already emerged insects that might be just on the surface. Whereas the kind of probers with their longer bills are going to be more of these kind of aquatic sediment invertebrates, but a lot of them are just kind of your general aquatic invertebrates like chironomids. They'll kind of forage. They tend to be generalists and will kind of forage on generalists related to bill size. And we'll kind of forage on whatever's kind of in there. And then to point out on one of the really kind of, in addition to invertebrates, one of the really important migratory areas for shorebirds, ones that may also be coming over this direction, is the Delaware Bay area, where they forage on horseshoe crab eggs. And that's a really important food source for many of the shorebirds during the migratory time. Again, this is related to the piping plover, I think, and it's about kind of what has the biggest factor in the plover's resurgence, and I think it's been these beach closures. So finding the nests and actually closing down the area in which they're nesting to beachgoers, and keeping people and dogs away from where the nesting area is.
Great. Well, thank you, Marie. It's 1 o'clock now, and we got through all the questions, lots of them.
Excellent.
So thanks very much for the interesting talk. And I'll just remind everybody that the next webinar is Shelley Dubé, who is also from UW-Stevens Point, talking about mammals around Wisconsin lakes next week on Tuesday at 12 o'clock. So we'll see you then. Thanks again, Marie.
All right. Thanks so much for having me.